The next question, Sheri, can you give us your thoughts on this next topic? What are the most common findings in an audit?
Hey, so this I think is actually based on several of the audits that we've been on as teams over the last year. I think these are the most common ones that are showing up. And of course, they're not, it all depends on the site, but we'll start with MOC PSSR elements. Failure to conduct or document the pre-startup safety review. So you might do the whole MOC, management of change, fill out all the documentation properly, and then the pre-startup safety review for that MOC is not documented. It might have happened, but there's no documentation. So again, that's a finding that we find frequently. Next one for MOC PSSR, failure to conduct the training of the affected personnel. When you do an MOC and you add stuff into it, some people have very good programs they put in place that they make sure that MOC and the changes are put out in the operating, in the control rooms for the operators. But in some cases, that does not happen, and there is no training documented for the personnel. Next, let's move into PSI. So we've just grabbed some from multiple different elements. So from a process safety information element, missing or electrical classification drawings that aren't up to date. So electrical classification drawings are a requirement for PSM so that everyone understands what type of equipment they can put in place based on the flammability, the materials and their flammability in the area, and if they're in the area. And those should be updated based on newer information, or if you make changes to your process, if you add additional processes to your site. And so we do find that people have not done their updates, or in some cases they don't have their electrical classification drawings. Missing safety system documentation. We talked about earlier, that's what we're going to be looking for, is your design basis for your safety systems. And there typically is information missing for safety systems, be it fire water systems, ventilation systems is a big one. If for some reason you have ventilation systems that help you protect people in control rooms, those are safety instruments. I mean, they're safety systems that should have the design basis and then the inspection and testing with that. Fire and gas detection systems and emergency shutdown systems. That information can be missing. And then PSVs. PSVs were a hot topic many years ago, and surprisingly enough, PSVs are design basis is still something we run into as an issue pretty much at every site we go to. There are PSVs that are in service that are supposed to be protecting equipment, and they do not have a valid design basis available for them. Another thing for PSI, the safe operating limits and consequences of deviation for equipment. And this goes to, we're going to get to operating procedures next. A definition of what is a safe, where is a safe place to run your equipment, and where is it not safe to run your equipment. So we do find that lacking in multiple sites. And then we'll go to operating procedures. Operating procedures, safe operating limits and consequences of deviations and the steps to avoid those deviations. That is a very difficult, it seems to be a difficult thing for people to put into their operating procedures. And we find this in a majority of the places that we audit. The reason is, first of all, defining safe operating limits and troubleshooting limits. And you know, when does the operator start troubleshooting? When do they say, no more troubleshooting, we're done? The safe operating limits, first defining those is difficult. And so we don't see that happening. And then the next step is, even if safe operating limits are defined, the consequences of deviations sometimes are, when we hit this high pressure, the process will shut down. Well, that is not the consequence of deviation that we're looking for from a PSM standpoint, because we're looking for the safety consequence. And so there still are a lot of issues with consequences of deviation and people understanding what a consequence of deviation is, and then making sure that you know those steps to avoid the safety deviation and the consequence. Next one for operating procedures is that there's supposed to be an annual certification that the operating procedures are current and accurate. And I would say that 80% of the audits that we've done, that certification is not available. And that one should be, it shouldn't be that difficult, but it's just something that gets missed. Or otherwise people are doing it, management has it in place, they're doing it, and then you change who's running the site or running the unit, and then that stuff can get lost. But that is very common with operating procedures as a finding. Mechanical integrity, not identifying the PSM critical equipment. If the PSM critical equipment is not defined, it's very difficult to make sure that your testing and inspection is going to be appropriate for that equipment. So that would be the first step. And then if you do define your PSM critical equipment, or if by default you use certain equipment as safeguards in your PHA, but you do not document that you're testing and inspecting that, that will be a finding also. One last thing for hot work, and I know this came up earlier with the Firewatch. I would say that, well, everywhere that I've done a hot work audit, it is very common for people, for the Firewatch to not sign off the time that they left after the completion of the hot work. And it is required to be there, the Firewatch is required to be there for 30 minutes after the completion of the hot work. And that sign off is most often left off of the hot work permits. And so there will be findings on that.
Thank you very much, Sheri. Dawn or Judy, do you have anything to add to that one?
No, that was a pretty good summary of kind of the top 10 bad actors. I would add, stepping back one step on this, is that action tracking in general can be problematic. And this hits across all elements. It hits incident investigations, it hits PHAs, it hits MOCs and PSSRs, it hits lessons learned from emergency response activities, it hits everything. And I would encourage all sites to have effective action tracking systems, and to not use a tricky little thing called forward-looking language, where basically the action says, oh yes, I'm going to take care of that, no problem, and they close it. And then later, when your auditor comes, that auditor is unable to find any evidence that the action was actually addressed. There's another happy or not so happy phenomenon that you run into from time to time. I'll call it action tracking hopscotch. And that is where an action originates in one system and is shifted to another system and is shifted to another system, and along the way loses its urgency and eventually may be closed out on the basis of we don't know where this came from and there's no reason to do it. So I would encourage sites not to engage in action item hopscotch. It's a bad practice.
I'm going to approach it from a little different angle, and it's going to be silly ones to get findings on. Probably the most silly element to get a finding on is trade secrets. Because all you need to have is some statement of what you're doing with trade secrets and you're covered. And I've seen those statements, adequate statements, to be anywhere from about 2 sentences to 2 paragraphs. It doesn't take much, but I've seen people not have that and get hit for it, and it's silly. Probably the next one is, Sheri's already mentioned it, is that operating procedures 1, where you do your annual certification. It's so simple to have a list of the procedures and the date that you did that annual certification. And as Sheri said, people miss it, and it's a silly one to get cited on or to get a finding on because it's so simple to do and doesn't take much time. And then the third one that I'll bring up is employee participation statement. Usually takes a little bit more to do those, but it's not that difficult to do. It's something that you need to do. And if you don't have it and you get hit for it, you should be red-faced about it because it's kind of a silly one to get a finding on. I'm done.